Good morning.
Recording in progress.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from today. Thank you and welcome to another session of the ACA Global Markets with Jim Fitzpatrick. On this platform, we discuss cashew markets and the key factors that affect it. As the West African cashew season draws to an end, today we will be reviewing the 2026 cashew season in West Africa. We want to understand the major trends this year. Jim will soon lead us in this review. Be part of this discussion, share your comments with us, and if you have any questions, you can ask them as well in the Q&A box. As always, the session is available in both English and French. You can select your preferred language by clicking on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen, and then you mute the original language. We are also streaming live on the official ACA Facebook page and YouTube channel. Feel free to follow and share with your network. This session is brought to you by the African Cashew Alliance with the kind support of the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Com Cashew Projects, the Cashew Club, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Before I hand over to Jim, We are just 62 days to the biggest cashew event in Africa, the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo, which will take place in Accra, Ghana from the 15th to the 18th of September 2026. The conference will be on the theme Sustainable Cashew Supply Through Policy, Investment and Partnership. Join hundreds of cashew stakeholders to network, share experiences, and discuss the future of the cashew industry. Online registration is ongoing. Take advantage of the early bird registration period to secure your spots at reduced conference rates. Visit the ACA website www.africancashewanalliance.com to register now. Early bird registration ends on 31st August 2026. Now to our discussion. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Isaac. How are you?
Very well. How are you too?
Well, I'm going nicely. I've been looking at West African cashew production this year. We've been looking at some of the issues around it, and we're looking forward to an interesting session. So before we get into this, let's just have a quick look at the market. It's not been an especially busy period, but we're coming to the conclusion that this crop is round about the same size as the 2023 crop. The last and latest area to harvest, of course, is Guinea-Bissau, Gambia, Senegal, Sagabi as it's been christened, and it looks like the crop's coming in pretty well there. But generally speaking, across the region, the farm gate trade is ending now. This is the only time of the year when there's no harvest. We will see harvest start again in probably late August into September, and then we'll get into East Africa, Brazil, Indonesia. Much smaller crop. But for the meantime, we're just winding up the situation in West Africa. Raw nut prices remain steady, driven by costs, driven by strong holders, driven by the need for the product effectively. Kernels prices relatively stable, but they have firmed up in the last, I'd say in the last 10 days or so, a little bit more buying interest. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if that's short-lived. August tends to be a quiet period in the market. So maybe people are doing a little bit of covering before they take a break in August. That would certainly apply in Europe. It may well apply in North America too. Large nuts continue to make good premiums. Demand, I think demand is relatively stable. It's a little bit slower in Asia than it is in Europe. It's quite steady in the United States, but it is continuing to get not real economic shocks just now, but it's getting shocks to the sentiment of the market, and the sentiment in this market is a critical factor. Overall, I would say relatively well-balanced supply and demand. The worries about supply from earlier in the year are pretty much gone, and I'm going to talk about that when we come to West Africa. And I don't think that demand this year is going to be anything particularly spectacular, given the impact of higher oil prices. We've spoken about it before, and the generally poor economic news. Now, with just one note of caution, if we go back to 2022, when we had the Ukraine war, the attack by Russia, that was a time of significant impact of those economic factors in the second half of the year. It was demand in the second half that suffered. So just a note of caution on that. I don't say I'm seeing signals of that at this moment, but that's what happened in 2022 in somewhat similar circumstances. Well, let's have a look at West Africa. Let's have a look at the situation there. And we'll have a look at production, and we'll have a look at some of the major factors around policy, and we'll also have a look at some of the longer term factors. So let's start by, in a similar way, we'll have a look at some of the trends. So going back, if we go back to January, you may recall that the forecasts for the crop 2026 were really quite good. There were big numbers in Cote d'Ivoire, big numbers in Nigeria and elsewhere. That transformed in February, March into almost panic situation with regard to the crop, particularly Ghana. I think Ghana was leading the negative news at that moment. And that was transformed into a general worry about the West African crop. Now, that suited some people, suited some traders, and they seemed to think that their opinions were confirmed when there was a little bit of a slowdown mid-season. There was a bigger gap, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire between the first and the second crops. There was a slowdown in Ghana at a certain point because a lot of what's thought of as Ghanaian raw cashew nuts actually comes from Cote d'Ivoire. That was seen as the end of the crop, but it wasn't. The crop thereafter was relatively strong, at least in volume terms. And so we changed from very high forecast to a have we got a disaster on our hands question. And in the second half of the year, of the harvest season, it came back quite strong, and we're looking at relatively healthy volumes. But raw cashew nut prices were not impacted, mainly because of I think there's two things at play. I think one is the costs, so freight costs, insurance costs, a whole range of costs related to moving 3 million tons around the world. And I think also the fact that the traders holding the stock are in relatively strong position. And therefore, given the stable market, the decline in raw nut prices that might have been expected if the harvest turned out to be better than originally forecast in February and March didn't happen. And it doesn't look as if it's going to happen now either. So therefore, maybe kernels prices move up a little bit, but I can't be particularly positive on kernels prices simply because I think demand is not going to justify it. Buyers are not going to chase the market in any significant way. There is another feature this year, and this is a function of a big crop in Cambodia, particularly with Vietnamese buyers. And maybe it's not just Cambodia, maybe it's also improved production in East Africa. So what we saw in the first quarter was significant imports from Tanzania, more than ever before, due to the larger crop. The Cashew Board of Tanzania now estimates that at over 600,000 tons. It's hard to see the numbers on that, but it's not difficult to justify the numbers for at least 550,000 tons. That's a doubling of the crop in 5 years. That's a sobering thought in terms of overall supply. But those supplies mean that buyers, particularly Vietnamese buyers, can come later to the market. And that's something that the West African situation is adapting to. So when we look at it today, we see the raw nut trade delayed because of the policy of windows for processors to buy in Cote d'Ivoire, in Burkina Faso, but also the fact that there's much more available from other areas, East Africa and Cambodia, obviously. So buyers simply don't need to come to the market as they might have done years ago. They don't need to be there on day one anymore, and that affects the dynamics of the market. So looking at this from a West African point of view, we're seeing more processing, slower sales of raw cashew nuts, increased market share in Europe, which is interesting, but it's not uniform. Cote d'Ivoire is absolutely leading the way. Other countries, in 2025, surprisingly, we saw an increase in the share of African cashew kernels consumed in Europe, but many countries experienced a fall in their exports to the European market, which seems to be something of a contradiction. And of course, it's essentially to do with the growth in the Burma kernels trade. So although raw nut buyers may come later to the market, Vietnam is still importing large volumes through Burma kernels. And this is actually a growing trend. I think the fact that countries like Cote d'Ivoire have significant market share in Europe ease the impact of the war in the Gulf. If you think about it, if it were not for processing, what would have happened on farm gate prices in West Africa in the course of this season as the raw nut trade was slower and the raw nut trade was disrupted? But the economy in the European Union particularly was much less impacted this time by this war than, for example, India or China. So that meant that the demand for cashew kernels was less disrupted this year. And that's a direct result of processing. And there's a lesson in that, I think, that processing is reducing dependence on a single market or two markets and spreading the risk a little bit. So there's more than just adding value to it. There's diversification of markets, which is an important risk management tool. We're also seeing a lot of policy developments this year. It's not consistent across the region. We're seeing different conversations, different methodologies. There is a certain amount of copying the successful policies of some countries, but there's also, in some cases, adapting that in a way that wouldn't necessarily be consistent with good practice. And we are seeing still a certain amount of, I call it knee-jerk reaction to conditions in the market. And that, to me, that's worrying. The lack of harmonization across the region is also worrying, and that's helping to develop this continued informal trade. It's always been a factor, but it's actually getting larger as the differences in policy, and particularly export tax, are more and more seen across the region. So let's dig into some of the numbers. We'll have a look at production numbers, we'll have a little look at processing, and we'll have a look at the individual countries. I'm going to pick out the 6 major countries of the region. But first, the big picture, and you can see, hopefully on your screen, the production share of global production in the region. So in 2025, it was about 50% of the crop was grown in West Africa. This year, it looks like, and we're not finished just yet, but it looks like it's about 47%. It's been fairly consistent over the years. West Africa is a fast-growing area, and in this year, it has again taken over the leadership in growth in cashew production, which was, growth at least, was dominated by Cambodia from 2020 probably through to 2024. So overall, you can see world production in blue, West Africa in green, and it's clear West Africa is the single most important producing region. There's no news in that. But when we look at the trends, what we see is relatively similar trends worldwide and in West Africa. In this period, from 2021, 2022, this is the period when Cambodia was driving the growth in world production. But since 2020, 2023 to this year, again, West Africa is really the driver of world growth. And we are seeing significant growth. And this is something we've touched on before, and we're going to talk about this again because this is the biggest issue in the market. Worldwide, we've got growth of about 7.3% per annum. That is fast growth in production. In West Africa, the largest producing region, that is 8.9%. So as Cambodia's growth has eased, West Africa has become more and more important to this figure. And of course, as we've spoken about before, this level of growth in production is much faster than the current level of growth in consumption. And that's a factor we all should be concerned about, looking forward to the rest of this decade and beyond. If we look at the percentage shares over the longer period, you can see since 2016, it's ranged from 43 up to as high as 52%, but relatively consistent. West Africa's share of world production is relatively consistent in or around 47 to 50%, depending on the world crop. And that dwarfs most other places. Even if you take Vietnam and Cambodia combined, they're only 23% when combined compared to 47% in West Africa. So it is very much the driver. What happens in West Africa really impacts the supply situation worldwide. And India, East Africa, all significant producers, but not really going to change the world in the sense that if we had a poor crop in India or a bumper crop in India, it would affect the Indian market, but of course it's not going to have a huge impact on worldwide supply. Today, it's about what happens in West Africa and what happens in Cambodia in terms of driving production. Let's have a look at West Africa just within the continent itself, and you can see that 82% of Africa's cashews are grown in West Africa, maybe I just need to define West Africa a little bit in terms of the production region. So I'm talking about the range of countries from east to west, from Nigeria all the way around to Senegal. So the crop starting probably February in Nigeria, maybe a little earlier, and then finishing in July, August in Senegal. And it's not always a straight line pattern either, as we saw this year, and that was one of the interesting features of this year. But it is a growing production region. So again, just need to keep an eye on this. West Africa, just under 3 million tons at this rate of growth. So if you're looking at 9% growth on 3 million tons, you are adding significantly to world supply every year. What are the important countries in the region? Well, I've just mentioned Nigeria, but you can see Cote d'Ivoire dominates 23% of the production. If you look then for the next level, you're looking at Guinea-Bissau, around 300,000 tons, maybe a little bit more. Nigeria, Benin, Ghana, Burkina Faso. So this 2.8 to 2.9 million tons is produced in relatively few countries in this region, and you can see them highlighted on the map on the right-hand side. Changes to the trend in these countries, the impact of climate change in the future. And climate change is not necessarily negative for cashews. It may actually increase the area that we can plant cashew trees on, whilst decreasing the area, for example, where crops like cocoa might grow, increasing dependence on cashews, increasing the area that's suitable to grow cashews in. And there's some interesting research being sponsored by MoveCom Cashew. I think that'll come out quite soon if it's not out already, but it's showing that the area suitable to grow cashews in this area of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire is actually going to increase with climate change. Yeah, there will be some loss in the northern part, but the area will increase. So it does appear as if this longer term trend for growth, the 10-year trend, will continue, and we will continue to see significant growth in production in that area. If we look at the countries, just to put that in a chart, you can see that how dominant Cote d'Ivoire with its 1.549 million tons last year, about 1.4 this year. You can see how dominant it is. So what's actually happened is that over the years, we've seen a shift in production. I was looking at old production figures. Actually, I was looking at it. I'll talk about them later. I was looking at them so we could talk about El Nino today, and I'll do that towards the end of the webinar. One of the most notable factors is the shift in production volumes from India as the dominant producer back in 1998, the time I was looking at. West Africa was only producing about 200,000 tons at that time. Today it's 2.8 million. Imagine if that was to happen again in the next 25 years or so. And in the region, what we see some countries are growing faster than the average. Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Burkina Faso have been growing faster than the average, and some have been growing more slowly. So Benin, for example, Guinea-Bissau, a significant producer, but the country has so many cashew trees, the room for expansion is relatively limited. And Ghana, too, has been growing more slowly. Although you may see some of the Ghanaian figures suggesting otherwise, if you factor in how much of that material comes across borders, both west and east, as of course more regulated from the north, but nonetheless a lot of that product comes from other countries. Ghana is actually growing quite slowly at the moment in terms of its cashew production. So not uniform across the region, still growing across the region and likely to continue to grow. I'm going to focus in now on the biggest producer. Cote d'Ivoire is really the center of production today in West Africa, and you can see why. Its crop has been a little bit variable in recent years, ranging from relatively below 1 million tons, seems low back in 2021, to last year's record 1.5, almost 1.55 million tons. And this year, we think it's about 1.4 million tons. Now, the CCIK, the regulatory body, is coming around to that view as well. They're not quite with us, but we're beginning to look at that. And I think it's interesting when we talk about how the market evolved this year to look at some of the estimates in the crop. So back in January, it looked good. The CCRK gave us an estimate of about 1.6 million tonnes. Not surprising at that time. Most people thought this was going to be a really big crop again, just like 2025. But by February, end of February into March, most people were again concerned in Cote d'Ivoire, and the estimates were cut back to 1.3 million tonnes. There was even one estimate, and quite an informed trade estimate, that had the crop down to 950,000 tonnes. You've always got to wonder about trade estimates, though, whether they are, telling us what they'd like us to believe or telling us something based on relatively limited information. As the year's gone on, CCRK has now come around to the estimate of 1.3 to 1.35 million tonnes. I think that's pretty decent, well-informed estimate. And when we have a look at the numbers, I come out with 1.4 million. That'll be revised again, but I feel it might be there. It might even be a little bit more than that. And this was down to that as it evolved, we had a weak harmattan to begin with. The first crop was significantly lower than 2025. Processors were buying, which is a little bit less impactful market-wise than when exporters buy. Although exporters were buying as well, as we'll talk about in a while. RCN traders came to the conclusion it was a poor crop, but it hasn't been a poor crop. To my mind, I think 1.4 million tonnes is a pretty decent crop. It's, what are we looking at, the third largest crop in history. It's probably something like 2023's crop. But what it has been, it's been a long crop. It's still coming in, it's still being harvested in some areas. Now, the quality has gone down through the course of the season, and the quality overall this year was not ideal, but some processors continue to buy today. And it's ongoing, and we're well into July at this point. I think this will be the second largest crop ever. I think it will, in the end, turn out to be a little bit bigger in volume terms, at least, than 2023. Not actually comparable in terms of its quality, and we can calculate that the lower quality does impact the useful kernels to be harvested from the raw nuts. But if we just think raw nuts, it's probably the second largest crop in history. That's far from the discussions we would have been listening to during February and March. People were talking crop disaster. And I think that was largely because of this gap between the first and second crops. It dried up a little bit for a period, 3 or 4 weeks. There wasn't very much around, and people came to the conclusion, understandably, that that was the end of the crop. But it was far from that, and it's still going on. So the minimum price set at 400 CFA, and that was not set in knowledge of any problem with the crop. It was set in the expectation of a good crop. Reasonable price for farmers, not a bad price for processors, but it's turned out to be quite difficult to defend, again, mainly because the quality of the raw nuts has declined, and also the fact that RCN buyers have come a little bit later to the market. I think as, generally speaking, production gets larger, that minimum prices and reference prices become more difficult for the authorities to defend. Farmers' expectations get disappointed, and that could have a long-term impact not only on farmers, but on production. So it'll be interesting to see, with prices traded as low as 250 CFA, when the minimum is 400, it'll be interesting to see how that impacts farmers' thinking over the longer run. Now, it may be that they're happy. It may be that they're happy with the 250. It may be that they understand quality is an issue. But they may also be disappointed by the fact that the minimum price that they're promised is impossible to achieve. So these are 4 issues I think that have emerged. So in Cote d'Ivoire, like many countries, we have a window in which it is forbidden to export raw cashew nuts. This is supposed to allow processors to buy what they need from the farms in that period. And I think it's a great idea. I think it works well for the most part, but it's not perfect, far from it. And what we see in Côte d'Ivoire, and a lot of this is about implementation and the difficulty in implementing complex regulations and complex policies. And it's sometimes also about the lack of resources. If you introduce complexity into regulation, you also need to introduce enough resources to enforce it, and you need to inform and educate people the benefits of following the regulations. What we saw this year was exporters buying during the window. Now, they couldn't export, but they could buy it, store it on trucks, store it in more small warehouses. They couldn't move it, but they could hold it, and that happens. Secondly, we've seen, I think last year, again this year, is that some processors are buying in the window as a processor, but with the intention of exporting the raw cashew nuts. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. Bear in mind that some of the processors in Côte d'Ivoire are amongst the largest raw cashew nut traders in the market. They can take advantage, fill the warehouse. We're going to process 30,000 tons this year. Let's buy 40, we'll export 10. And that's a factor. How do we know that's happening? How do we think it's happening? Well, if you look at the kernels market, exports of kernels, trade in kernels, domestic consumption of kernels, if you look at that and compare what was bought as RCN for processing, there's a mismatch. And I think that mismatch was product exported by processors. Now, there's no legal impediment to them doing that, but I think it is certainly not in the spirit of the agreement. And I think it is exploiting the benefits that have been given to processors. Third factor is informal trade. Significant informal trade continues. It's not just about avoiding export tax, although that's a factor for some. I think there's two types of informal trade. There's the cross-border trade where farms are situated close to the border. They, as local people, don't really see the border as an important factor. There was similarly in my country, same thing. We had a border imposed about 100 years ago in the middle of the country. The people living on that border, it's not visible, they don't see it, and they continue to do their business across the border years after. I think the same in cashews. And for many people, on the Ivorian Ghanaian border, it makes sense that the raw nuts would move through Ghana. So this is something that has to be managed somehow, bearing in mind that there's a significant loss of revenue for the government through export tax when that happens, and generally distortion of trade. So I know that they are looking at that, but for the most part, the effort can only be made on the other kind of informal trade, which is, let's say, much more considered smuggling of truckloads, and that's to avoid export tax. And the fact I've mentioned, the fourth issue is defending the minimum quality defending the minimum price as quality falls is an issue. It's an issue partly because the minimum price is set at a fixed minimum and there's no sliding scale for quality. Although that would also be difficult to implement. It means that simply the market, at a certain point, the market just functions on supply and demand and the minimum price becomes irrelevant, especially as the quality declines during the year. So you will, generally speaking, see processors that have their own supply chains directly linked to farmers paying the minimum price. Many processors buy from local buyers, assemblers, traders, and they do not know if those traders have paid minimum price to the farmers. So there is a significant part of the industry, I would say perhaps the majority of the industry, doesn't have a direct supply chain with farmers, and they're much more likely somewhere in their chain that they haven't paid the minimum price for the raw material. Big job to fix any of these issues. This is a major project, and generally speaking, policy and regulation in the country has been really positive. These are refinements and aspects that need to be addressed, in my view. So let's have a look at processing. So now we're looking at processing in Côte d'Ivoire, and we're comparing that to the rest of Africa. So you can see Côte d'Ivoire, of course, in orange. You can see the volumes processed and an estimate of this year. Now, this year's estimate is based obviously not on what's been processed, but what's been reported as procured by processors. what you do see is that Cote d'Ivoire now has 8% share of world's processing. It's growing very quickly. It's been growing at 24%. It's a significant processor today, and it's continuing to grow, and mainly based on these large semi-mechanized factories. And if we have a look at the markets for the Ivorian cashew kernels, we can see that two things stand out. First of all, the success in the European market. 38% of Ivorian kernels go to the European Union. Another 2% goes to the UK. So we're around about 40% going to the European market. But the other factor that stands out, of course, is that Vietnam is the second largest client. Or if you take it country by country, leaving the EU out as a bloc, Vietnam is the largest client. And those are, of course, Burma kernels. 28%. So that means, about 1/3 of the processing in Cote d'Ivoire. So 1/3 of this figure of 459,000 tons processed last year, 1/3 of that is partial processing, Burma kernels. Impact leaves the shells behind, doesn't create as many jobs, doesn't do anything for the reputation of the country, and creates a bigger dependence on a single customer, Vietnam, which is also the largest customer, with about 800,000 tons, something like that, of raw cashew nuts. So factors for this year on processing: continued growth, but I don't think all of the raw cashew nuts that have been procured, 650,000 tons reported by CCIK, will be processed. I see it as increasing. I think processing will increase. It'll be more than it was last year. I'm guessing around about 550,000 tons. It's a sobering thought for the rest of us to think that 2 of every 3 cashews processed in Africa are processed in Cote d'Ivoire. And that's a testament to the success of the country in developing processing investment. But it's also a pointer towards the lack of success or the struggles in other countries. Just to explain how you might think it's a bit impertinent of me to contradict some of the figures mentioned officially. When we look, I think the processing volumes, as publicly stated, may be overstated, simply because when we look at the kernels trade, we can't reconcile it unless there was a really low outturn, and I'm talking 15%, and I don't think that's possible. But if you take an average outturn at around about 22% net, it's impossible to match the official processing figure with the kernels trade. And that's why we come out with a slightly lower estimate than you might see elsewhere. So right now, I think we're going to have a pretty good year for processing in Cote d'Ivoire. It's not easy because the quality of the raw nuts has been lower than last year for sure, but even lower than the average over the years. There is at the moment something of a stock of cashew kernels in the country, particularly hulls. Of course, we don't know how that's arisen, but it may well be that people did not sell forward simply because they weren't sure how the crop would grow. But there's also, for some, another factor. Even some of the large factories are just very poor at selling. And they miss the market, and they miss their opportunities. Now, fortunately, this year, it won't affect them in terms of market price, because market prices have been stable, quite steady at the moment. But it does affect cash flow. So it's an interesting observation to hear processors talking about the need for more working capital, the need for some form of soft financing for their working capital, and at the same time to be sitting on cashew kernels in their warehouses. As a result of this, there has been an evolution of a trade in cashew kernels in the country. Larger, better organized, better marketers buying cashew kernels from smaller companies, usually smaller, but not always smaller companies, who have struggled to make their sales. And it is one of the things, I mean, if you've attended this webinar regularly, you've heard me say it before, but it is one of the things that's neglected in business planning for cashew processors in Africa, simply to have a good sales team. The idea that there's a big market out there, they'll come, is not true. You really do need to get properly organized, have a good marketing team. Okay, so back to Cote d'Ivoire. Look at the disappearance. So this is something that we try to do. I've been talking to ACA market information team recently on how we can calculate the net disappearance, because this is how we can sort out some of the myths, some of the misinformation, and some of the gaps in the market in terms of understanding how it works. So if we look at last year compared to this year, some of this is now what we think. We're pretty sure on the crop estimate. So the crop down about 9.5%. I think that's pretty clear now. Processing, procurement is well up. Procurement is up to 650,000 tons. I think processing will be about 550,000 tons. That's up by 19%. That's fantastic. That's really impressive. If that continues year on year, we're going to see some really impressive performance. Exports, lower crop, more processing. Well, exports are bound to fall back. And the total volume exported could slip back by about 9.5%, we think. Obviously, time will tell. The similar factors, the illegal trade, partially due to better enforcement, but also due to a smaller crop, illegal trade mainly into Ghana. Of course, that's likely to fall too by about the same amount. And that will mean, add all of that up, and it will mean that the carry-out stock, which was significant last year, the calculated carry-out stock, I mean, I don't go around the warehouses counting the bags, but calculated, it was about 173,000 tons of raw cashew nuts. This year, the same calculation indicates about 65,000 tons, so significantly less. That means, for example, that those imports into Vietnam in the first quarter will not happen next year, because that raw material will not exist. Now, one thing to add, this would include anything that was in transit, anything that was stored without being custom cleared in India or Vietnam at the end of 2025. And we do that because we use the import figures to help us generate the overall disappearance. So it's clear that there's less available, there's more process, and that's going to lead to a tighter position at the end of the year. A lot of these figures you could, if you were doing this for kernels, we do this on raw cashew nuts, but if you were to calculate for kernels, you could probably reduce the figures by another 2 to 3% because of lower quality and therefore lower outturn yields. So overall, not the greatest year in history for Cote d'Ivoire, but frankly, progress. In the end, a decent crop, lower quality, coping with difficult weather conditions, increased processing. Now, there are a lot of changes in regulation. We'll talk about a few of those shortly. But again, it does look like continued good progress in the country. Moving to Benin. So Benin is also a significant producer, much smaller, of course, than Cote d'Ivoire, a world share of about 3%. It's growing around 7%. So earlier I was talking about those countries growing at below the average of the region. Benin is one of those, but still growth at this level is significant. I mean, you can't say it's slow growth. It's pretty fast growth at these rates. You can see the rates at the top of the slide. Overall, we see a long-term positive trend in production. There is some doubt on the production figures in Benin. The official figures are far higher than the trade figures. How do we get to our figures? Well, we base it on trade. So we will take the production estimate. We'll have a look at the hectares. We'll have a think about the average yield, which doesn't change a lot from year to year. And then we look at what's gone across the border. How do we know what's gone across the border? Well, we don't know from the Benin side because it's illegal, of course, but we do know from the receiving side. And then we look at kernels processing and kernels exports. So we come to a crop probably this year between 170 and 180,000 tons. You will see early season official estimates way higher than that. I just can't justify that. So the crop down probably 10 to 15%, quite difficult to get the exact numbers because of the smuggling. We'll work those out towards the end of the year. Quality a little bit lower, but not poor. The quality in Benin is also pretty good. A little bit lower this year, but no real problem with it. And the processors tell us that they are going to process about 80,000 tons on what they know. That's about 45% of the crop. That's really impressive. Bear in mind, though, that the capacity in Benin, mainly in the new or relatively new Arise project in the GDIZ, there's enough capacity to process 60% of the crop. So they're getting there. I know it's been difficult, but they're getting there. And we see much more activity from Benin in the international kernels market. In terms of growth of production, I think this may settle down a little bit now in Benin. The farm gate prices have not been moving positively in recent years. The dependence on the informal trade, dependence on smuggling effectively, is not good for business. It doesn't build confidence. And I think that perhaps the export ban needs to be revisited in terms of regularizing trade. It cannot be a good idea that 55% of your cashew nuts go out illegally. That's just doesn't work in the long term. So perhaps the authorities in Benin will have a review on that policy. If we look at Nigeria, if you follow cashew news in West Africa, Nigeria has been at the forefront of that for most of this year so far. Nigeria produces something like 5.5% of the world's cashews. It has been growing quickly, but it's slowing down now. Always challenging to work out the production figure, again, because of these border trade coming in from Benin. And that's increased. The border trade into Nigeria has increased this year because of the situation. Chances are there will be something introduced. So this year we're looking at a crop, I think it's somewhere between 300 and 320,000 tons. Some of the estimates we got early talked about 400,000 tons, but it seems that that includes what's coming across the border from Benin. And that would make perfect sense. That means that production, somewhere around about 300, 320,000 tons, a bit less than last year, not hugely less than last year, but a little bit lower. But generally speaking, it's been growing quickly. That growth is beginning to slow down now. You obviously are not going to get fast growth every year. Crop, I think, better than last year, not quite as good. Sorry, not better than last year, better than 2024, but not quite as good as last year. It is supplemented by the imports from Benin. It's been a controversial season. There's been talk of everything. There's been talk about export bans. There's been talk about taxation. There's been talk about new trade associations. There's been talk about establishing some form of board, I suppose we could call it, for want of a better word. And that is continuing to go on. That became heated. It became rather unseemly in international terms, I'd have to say. But it is calming down now, with the leadership issues at the Cashew Association resolved. Still some way to go, but it does look as if Nigeria will introduce a cashew policy. Whether that includes the imposition of taxes on the export of RCN remains to be seen. But I think there's a chance of some form of taxation being introduced. Some of the proposals are off the charts. I mean, we've seen numbers like $300 a ton. This is absolutely not going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is an export tax introduced. Processors remain under pressure, and that's one of the motivations for regulating the sector. As one of the last two remaining countries without a regulation of the cashew sector, at least, let's say, there is regulation everywhere, but if we call about a kind of a complex regulation, or a regulation that tries to determine the future of the sector away from simple free market, Nigeria is one of only two remaining, and there will be only one remaining, I think, by the end of this year. Nigeria will have intervened. Now, I doubt if it'll be as interventionist as policies in Benin, for example. I think a ban of exports is unlikely, but I wouldn't be surprised to see this taxation, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some positive incentivization perhaps through tax breaks, some other fiscal measures for Nigeria. But we're not talking subsidy. I don't think we're going to see that. But that might improve investment in processing, and it might improve profitability in existing processing in Nigeria. It will be interesting to see. They are going through a kind of consultative phase at the moment. There are many ideas on the table. They vary widely. Hopefully some good sense will be prevailing, and we'll see some interesting developments there. Let's be clear, Nigeria will continue to be a significant exporter of raw cashew nuts, but it will, I believe, start to fully utilize its processing capacity. And there are some good, large, modern factories there, but Nigeria also has the potential to develop a significant domestic market. Unlike many other countries, the chances of Nigerian consumers consuming cashews, partly because there are so many people, but also because there are so many urban people, are quite high. So I think we might see domestic consumption in Nigeria pick up strongly in the coming years, economics allowing. Let's say we see return to growth, return to a positive economic trajectory. So that's Nigeria growing strongly, definitely over the last few years, significant growth, and that seems likely to continue. If we look at Burkina Faso, obviously a much more complex situation, politically complex. There is a war of sorts going on in the country at the moment, tragic as it is, and it obviously affects everything that happens. In the cashew area, I understand that it's possible to continue to do business and that it is quite secure. So that area remains relatively stable, and let's hope there's a return to full stability in the country. Production this year, it appears to have been impacted by the weather, but it's not. It doesn't appear to be particularly lower than what we would have expected. So I'm wondering if maybe some of the forecasts of a much bigger crop would have turned out to be correct this year had the weather been a little bit kinder. So it'll be interesting to see next year how that goes. But we are looking at continued growth. We've seen a step up in recent years, and that's likely to continue. In fact, the long-term growth is one of the fastest growing in the region. I think it might be the fastest growing in the region. And that slowed down in recent years, but it still is a fast-growing producer. The rules in Burkina Faso for exporters of raw cashew nuts are that they can procure from the farmers, the exporters can procure from the farmers during the season, but they must supply a proportion to local processors. And this is complex at best. And this year we saw raw cashew nut prices at the farm gate driven up to very difficult to explain levels. It has been extremely difficult to understand why buyers would be paying prices like 650 CFA, 700 CFA, around 875 up as high as $1,200 per ton at the farm gate for a product which they could buy elsewhere at maybe 400 CFI in Côte d'Ivoire, for example. Very difficult to understand, and you do have to wonder whether or not there's some other factor at play. Whatever factors are at play, it made life difficult for processors. It made farm gate prices very high, and it meant that even when processors ended up buying from traders, they were paying really high prices for raw material in a market which they're not large enough as a country, as a supplier, to change the market. They have to cope with the market conditions, but their domestic market was sky high at the farm gate this year. And that is something that needs to be further looked at, because it's clear that there may be other factors at play. If we look at processing, well, if you looked at the claims processing, you would find a figure something like 60, 70,000 tons, but that's probably overstated. At least one of the factories has a figure that's just not possible given the setup that they've got. I think the processing capacity in real terms is about 35,000 tons. I think that'll increase because some of the new processing facilities will grow their capacity in the coming years, but it's still far away from the crop, but certainly moving in the right direction. And that is in an environment that's not particularly comfortable for investors at the moment. So most investment is likely to be domestic. What is interesting, I think, in Burkina Faso is the availability of organic raw cashew nuts. It looks like something just under 10% of the crop is actually organic certified. That drives the price up. Organic suppliers are entitled to a premium. But it also means that there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity supplying buyers of organic cashew kernels, particularly in Europe, but also in North America. And that's a segment that's growing quickly. It's a small segment, but it's a segment that's growing quickly. So Burkina Faso, not a particularly bad year in terms of production, but a difficult year in terms of regulation and trade at the farm gate. If you look at Ghana, and Ghana has been the most confusing of all of the countries that I would look at this year. Some of the announcements official, some of the market information unofficial has been particularly confusing. We started with a very optimistic estimate, 250,000 tons from the Ministry of Agriculture. I think realistic crop in Ghana is about 150,000 tons at the moment. We have to adjust it for what may be coming across the border. What we did see this year was the quantity improved as the year went on after a very poor start, but the quality didn't really. This was not a typical Ghanaian crop in terms of its quality. It wasn't as Ghana is known for high quality raw cashew nuts with great processing characteristics, but this year quality was heavily impacted by the weather conditions. So right now, processing in Ghana definitely under pressure. Ghana, I often say to people that if we go back to around about 2014, just over 10 years ago, if we go back and think about what were the countries ripe for investment in cashew processing at that time, you would have put Ghana at the top of the list. It just didn't happen. There's virtually no more processing capacity today in Ghana than there was then. Yeah, some have opened, some have closed, but it's around about the same in the total processing capacity. And that's something of a mystery as to how that came about. You could say that investment moved to Cote d'Ivoire due to the subsidies, and I think that would be partially true. You could say that it was simply better to export rather the raw nuts than to process them. And that might hold some weather. There was a high-profile opening of a large factory, I think back in 2014, but the closing of that factory was equally high profile, and that may have put off investors. And it's interesting with investment. From an outsider's point of view, a non-cashew specialist investor's point of view, these things have big impact. A factory opens, a factory closes, that will definitely put investors off. In any case, it hasn't happened so far for Ghana. Now the attention will turn to policy and regulation for 2027, and we're getting some contradictory signals. We know there's a lot of consultants involved. I do consulting myself, as you know, but some of the advice is clearly not good. Authorities are following things that just are not going to work, in my view. And how do we know they're not going to work? Well, because they haven't worked anywhere else. So that's pretty clear. I feel there will be changes and developments in Ghana in 2027 in policy, perhaps around the management of the transit trade, those nuts coming in from Burkina particularly, but elsewhere too. Perhaps around managing the border trade, perhaps incentivizing processing investment. There's so much talk, and a lot of the talk is misunderstood. We saw a complete misunderstanding of a statement I think it was by the president, obviously very senior person. And when you read the statement, you don't read export ban, but it was reported as export ban and became, for a few days at least, became a fact. Ghana is going to ban the export of raw cashew nuts. But I don't think Ghana ever intended to either do that or even to say that. And it's been corrected since. But so we need to watch carefully what's said in Ghana. It's the greatest impact in the short term will be on the raw cashew nut trade, potentially on raw cashew nut production too. Good measures introduced may well stimulate further production. Prices in Ghana always high at the beginning of the season. Farmers benefit from that. Processors struggle with that. Some of the prices are just not workable for processors. But there has been a Cashew Council of Ghana established. I see some illustrious names on the board. I see good representation across the sector on the Cashew Council of Ghana, and hopefully that will have a positive influence in developing the cashew sector there. But keep an eye on Ghana, particularly when we get toward the end of the year and we're starting to focus more on the 2077 crop. Guinea-Bissau, pretty decent year in Guinea-Bissau. It looks like a good crop, 300,000 maybe, 300,000 plus. That would be one of the best crops ever. Early on, there were rumors of a rain damage. There had been some unusual rainfall patterns. Didn't amount to any problem. Quality's been good. Volume has been good. Farm gate prices started a little bit higher than last year. There's been good buying. And the last we heard from our reporter, the African Cashew Alliance reporter in Guinea-Bissau, is that about 250,000 tons has been commercialized, which effectively means prepared or exported as raw cashew nuts. Processing, there are processors, but it remains a pretty small volume. So generally speaking, positive situation in Guinea-Bissau from a production and export point of view. Not at all positive from a value addition point of view. We'll talk about processing in Guinea-Bissau another time. It's a complex subject. So let's have a look then at policy. We've seen a couple of things. We see, first of all, lack of harmonization. So there are different policies in different countries. Benin continues to have its export ban. Implementation is failing. Processing is increasing very positively in terms of the volume. Farm gate price is a little bit lower. So it's challenging to manage that supply chain, both for the processors and for the regulators. If we look in Côte d'Ivoire, I've spoken about this already. I think I've covered everything. Just to mention again, the subsidies are being phased out. That was announced earlier this year. It seems they're completely gone by 2028. They're reduced from this year. Interestingly, too, is that the window for processors has been widened. So that's the early season period during which exports are not allowed. And that's a positive move. And it's logical, given that processing is increasing, that processors will be given more time to source what they need. If you combine that with a minimum farm gate price, it protects the farmers. Problem is, once processors have finished buying, it's trying to defend that minimum farm gate price. And that has not worked. And I've pointed out some of the problems facing regulators in Côte d'Ivoire a little earlier. If we look in Ghana, let's just look for the new policy framework. Let's see more action. Let's talk in terms of how the sector develops. Nigeria, this year, highly controversial. There's an ongoing review. I think it's taking place this week, a consultation validation process, and then we will see what's decided on policy. I think there will be regulation of exports. I think there will be incentivization of processing, and let's hope that works out. Ghana has huge potential, I think. Burkina Faso, again, complex situation. I don't think we will see as much intervention in and changes in policy. The country's in a volatile position, but I don't think we're going to see a lot of changes in policy in the coming year. So the two countries I think we need to look at for volatility in policy would be Ghana and Nigeria. Both are significant exporters of raw cashew nuts. That will have an effect, particularly in the early part of next year, because both would be earlier to market. And that may well affect the the cost or the availability of raw cashew nuts in the early part of 2027, which now, halfway through this year, we're going to start looking forward to 2027. Informal trade. I've mentioned this before. I just wanted to touch on it again. This is a very important factor. Now, on the map, you'll see a series of arrows. The black arrows, that is logical, formal trade channels. So material from landlocked countries has to flow to ports for export because it's raw cashew nuts. If it were kernels, it would still flow, but in much less volume, of course. And then you see the red lines. And the red lines are the illegal or informal trade. Cote d'Ivoire into Ghana particularly, Benin now with the export ban in the last 3 or 4 years, into Togo, and this year mainly into Nigeria. I mean, this is a major factor in the area, and it's down to a lack of policy harmonization, and it's down to a simple infrastructure. When borders were drawn 50 or 60 years ago, they didn't really focus on whether or not how the cashew trade would flow. Of course, they didn't. The cashew trade didn't exist then. But they didn't focus on any trade. So you're naturally going to see some cross-border trade. And that's always going to be the case. But when you get that combined with differences in policy across countries, it leads to distortions. And smuggling is not good for business, not because it causes product to disappear, but simply because it changes the culture of the industry. So it's a factor to bear in mind. It also makes it more and more difficult to explain trade patterns, production, and all the other relative figures. What was the impact of all of this on raw cashew nut prices? Well, there isn't a great deal to say, to be frank about it. I mean, this is a chart of cashew nut prices going back to 2015. The red line is an index. So the way we chart the cashew trend is we take an index of the available raw cashew nuts, we bring everything back to a standard outturn of 48 pounds, and we calculate the price accordingly. And that's the red line. And you can see the trends. You can see this year prices moved up on last year, but they've stayed relatively stable throughout the season. So there hasn't been a great deal of volatility. The kind of reaction early in the season to thoughts that there might be a lower crop, it didn't really affect prices. Yeah, it steadied them a little bit, but it didn't create any kind of speculative bubble, the kind of thing that we've seen in years past. It didn't happen this year. And I think that's largely because the buyers of raw cashew nuts simply came to market a little bit later. So not a great deal to talk about on price. Stability is a good thing. Let's hope it continues. So we've looked at production, we've looked at processing in individual countries, we've talked about policy. I just thought, what is the African model for successful development of the cashew sector? And I think it's about the story. It's not so much a commodity. It's not price competition. When we look at processing in African countries, it's now mostly Vietnamese technology, some Indian, of course, but mostly Vietnamese. It's about large-scale advanced factories. The higher costs in Africa, things like power, for example, are covered by savings in the supply chain. So if we say it costs about $100 a ton to get your raw cashew nuts to your factory in Africa, and compare that to the cost of getting them to a factory in Vietnam, it's about 1/3 of the cost. That's taking into account freight, traders' margins, finance, and of course, export taxes. And that makes African processing competitive if it can get to, anywhere in the region of $400 a ton processing cost. That's per ton of raw cashew nuts. Focus on near markets, so focusing on Europe in particular, and we've seen that success, and we've seen all the advantages that African processors have. The focus has also been quickly to match buyers' needs on food safety. So most African factories tend to focus on doing this right. It's not just about getting a piece of paper that says you've got a BRC or an ISO accreditation. It is actually about implementing it. And the focus on the European market where African factories have been successful dictates that. You really have to be serious about food safety if you're selling in Europe. And, it's not always been the case in the cashew business. Yet we've all kinds of certificates knocking around, but practices in factories don't always match the certificates. But I think in most African factories they do. And I think that this move where processors don't compete on prices from West Africa are higher than from Vietnam, for example, meeting buyers' needs and taking advantage of the plentiful supply of raw cashew nuts nearby is meaning that African processing is a business. It may have been seen as a development project 20 years ago, but today it's very much a business, and it's a business in which there's an opportunity to make a profit. And that's not always the case in processing around the world. Processing is tough business for many people today. These factories in Africa have an opportunity to do really well, I think. So in summary then, in West Africa, we see production 6 to 9% lower in 2026. Unpredictable regulation remains a fact of life. Long-term growth in production, long-term growth in processing, and the RCN trade obviously less because processing is up, but not by much because production is also up. So in this year, quality was lower in most places. The central part of the overall region was most affected on that, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. We've talked about the regulatory system, and I think that the main thing in summary, I would say that it remains somewhat unpredictable. Definitely, some of the regulations are being played by the participants, mainly by traders, but also by processors in some cases. And it does need reform in that sense. Long-term growth, it's going to continue to grow. There's no reason at the moment for that trajectory to change. 8.9% regional growth, that'll continue. That is adding, 275,000 tons every year at least to supply, and that's significant, and that's going to have a significant impact as time goes on. Processing is up. A lot of it's based on Burma kernels. That applies Cote d'Ivoire, that applies in Nigeria. Processors, for many it's positive, but for some mixed fortunes, particularly if you're smaller or if you're not well managed or capitalized, you can have significant difficulties. Generally speaking, processing moving in the right direction. The raw cashew nut trade, I think, is changing. I think buyers are coming to market a little bit later. But I also see that prices, which this year for much of the season were out of alignment with cashew kernels prices, particularly even for highly competitive Vietnamese processors, higher costs and strong holders have kept prices relatively firm throughout the season. Don't really see any opportunity for that to change, at least in the short term. So in conclusion on West Africa, harvests better than was expected in February and March, not as big as last year. West Africa has returned to the leadership position in growth around the world. Current imports, RCN imports at destination and inventories of RCN and kernels are adequate. RCN prices hold, as I've been saying, and demand, generally speaking, both for RCN and for cashew kernels has been steady. We need to keep a close eye on the second half of the year just to see how the higher energy prices, for example, and of course, again, going up this week following further conflict in the Middle East. We just need to see how those affect market sentiment, but also consumer sentiment and consumer purchasing of tree nuts generally, but cashew nuts obviously in particular. Could be an interesting second half of the year from the demand side. Okay, so we've got a lot to talk about El Nino. Now, I'm not an expert on El Nino, but I did a bit of research and I thought we should just have a look at what's being said and see how that might impact on the cashew sector. So, in case you don't already know, El Nino is a warming of the ocean in the Pacific and a warming of the atmosphere. So it has been shown to have an impact on weather conditions And that's been researched, and it shows what kind of impact you can expect and where that can be expected. It's developing now, it'll peak in November, and probably impact crops that will come in 2027. So the first period, and this information is drawn from climate change and climate research. So this research is, the one I've used is American. There are so many different sources on this one. It's a really interesting subject. If you have the time, it is time consuming, but I had a look, and the June-August impact is likely to be in two areas. It's likely to be in Indonesia. We're talking cashews. You can see there's impacts elsewhere, but in cashews in Indonesia and in India. So the impact in June to August on India would be that if it was going to happen, that it would impact the monsoon. And there was a slow start to the monsoon, but the latest reports, at least the ones I read, show that the monsoon has been normalizing. I read on official sources that it was within 14% of normal by the middle of July. So it doesn't appear that that's going to have an immediate effect, but even so, it's unlikely to have a huge effect on the Indian crop. Indonesia, it may well have a big effect there. It did in the past. We saw a much lower crop, and I'll show some information on that shortly, but it could have an impact there. No impact in West Africa, no impact in East Africa. Now, the next segment is the December to February period. Obviously, this is a critical period for Northern Hemisphere cashew production. And it looks like the two key areas in that period that may be affected would be Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Cambodia, where about 21% of the world's cashews grow. So this can be significant. The impact of a strong El Nino would be to disrupt rainfall, to cause heat stress, but the timing is not clear. The timing and how it might impact, for example, cashew trees during the flowering stage is not at all clear. And that remains to be seen. So we definitely need to follow this very closely. It would appear on looking at the research that there is potential for a significant impact in Cambodia and Vietnam. And that is something that could have a major impact on overall production for 2027. Elsewhere in East Africa, where about 13% of the world's cashews grow at the moment, it would also have the impact of creating a drier and hotter conditions. Now, I don't think that that's going to have a huge effect in December to February on this coming crop. The crop will already be, should already be in by December. And what we would have been concerned about really was that there might be heavy rainfall during the harvest, which can be disruptive. But if we get dry, warm weather during the harvest, it's not a major problem. The crop in Tanzania, I'm told, looks pretty good. The availability of imported inputs is quite good, despite some of the reports that have been published on the ground. And I think the crop there and in Mozambique is progressing well. So we're not seeing a huge impact. So really two places to watch: India and the progression of the monsoon, and Cambodia, Vietnam, particularly when we get into November, just to look at the weather conditions and how they might impact flowering. So if we look at cashews, what I said, I'm going to have a look back at a significant El Nino event. So I was listening to a webinar recently from Expana, the market information company. They ran a webinar on El Nino. It's quite interesting. And the conclusion that the experts were coming to, and they're well-qualified experts, is that this season is looking most like 1997-98 El Nino. Probably this year is stronger, but it's that the way the temperature is developing, and they do monitor it, it looks like 1997, 1998. So I said, let's have a look at how cashew production, obviously it was at much lower levels then, but let's have a look at how it was impacted during that period. And certainly there was an impact. So the chart here on the bottom left is world cashew production in shell, or raw cashew nuts, 1993 up till 2000. And, you know, the most significant factor is clearly there was a big drop in 1998. 1998 would be the equivalent of 2027 in this current cycle. That year there was a drop of 8% in production. Now, a couple of things to bear in mind. Production was different areas. India dominated. Vietnam was a producer, but relatively small. So we have to look country by country. And again, we can see confirmation of what we might have expected. And production in 1998 in Vietnam dropped incredibly by 47%. The two countries that were most impacted at that time were Vietnam and Brazil. And now, Cambodia wasn't a major producer at that time. So we do not know, and it seems reasonable to conclude that the impact would be similar, but we cannot say for certain that the impact on Cambodia would be similar to the impact on Vietnam. We can say that it needs to be carefully looked at as the year goes on. But we can certainly track that the strong El Nino of 1997, 1998 had an impact on cashew production. We can see, if you look on the chart on the right-hand side, that it didn't really affect India. India had, yes, there was a fall from 97 to 1998, but if you look at the average production over the years, it wasn't a major fall. The anomaly there is 1997, which was a huge crop. But in 1998, kind of average crop, most countries were okay. There was very little impact in West Africa, albeit production at that time was much lower in West Africa. So I think we are right to be concerned that El Nino might have an impact on cashew production, particularly in Southeast Asia. And that's something that is definitely a cause for concern in the coming months. When will we know? I suppose we're going to know when we see flowering starting and throughout the flowering season. So we're looking at disrupted rainfall. We're looking at heat stress. So the timing of any very hot, very dry period would also be important. If it comes well after flowering, it's probably a positive thing. If it comes during flowering, or if you get heavy rainfalls during flowering, could be quite negative for the crop. So just a header. I mean, I'm not by no means an expert on El Nino, but I can track what they're saying, and I can see what impact it had in the past, and that gives cause for some concern on this. So I would suggest follow it closely. We will also try to follow it over the period. If we look at the impact on prices, so again, now we're tracking back. I keep data back to the early 1990s. And so I tracked back and looked at November 96 pricing of cashews. This chart shows right through to November 2004. But what you can see, 1999 February, prices start to rise and they peak then toward the end of the year and then fall away again. Interestingly, it was followed by a period of relative price stability. It was actually followed by a period of oversupply. I remember raw cashew nut prices were extremely low in that period. And I think I wouldn't be at all surprised to see a similar pattern emerge over the coming 2 or 3 years. But it did have an impact on price. But part of that, I looked at some market reports also for the period, and there's definitely an element of speculation. There's definitely an element of a speculative bubble developed when the crop was much lower in Vietnam. Now, the crop in Vietnam at that time was much smaller too, so it had less of an effect. But now it's different. It's 21% between Cambodia and Vietnam. So I think we should be cautious on this factor, but we should also recognize that there is an impact of El Nino on cashews, that it is specific to some areas and we know where to watch. If it has an impact, it's quite likely to lead to higher prices probably in the course of 2027. Maybe before that, if people start to speculate, definitely before that. But we should, just follow the cashew situation in Cambodia. There is going to be a conference, the EU-German CapSafe, in cooperation with CCF, the Cambodian Cashew Federation, has a conference this year, the Cashew and Pepper Forum. You can find details online, and it will coincide with the period of most concern in Cambodia. So that would be an interesting visit if you're going to go to Cambodia. I certainly am. It's going to be very interesting. So on El Nino then, conclusions, the main impact is possibly India, but the monsoon appears to be kind of normal up to now, and Southeast Asia, hot and dry. Between them, India is 13% of cashew production. The two countries that we talk about in Southeast Asia, 21%. Back in 1998, India was 37%. It wasn't affected, but Southeast Asia was 14%. So it's come up a long way. The 14% was mainly in Vietnam at that time. People talk, I thought I'd mention this because people always say cashew trees are resilient, particularly to drought, but the yields of those trees are not as resilient. The trees will survive, but the yields will be lower. We do need to bear that in mind. You can't assume that cashews can manage drought conditions. Overall, the percentage impact on production, if we look at where are cashews grown now compared to where they were grown then, the ascendancy of West Africa in particular, 47% this year of world production, as we've been talking about, probably means that an impact in 2027 would be less than the impact in 1998. It will impact, if you look at it, it could impact about 20% of the production. How much it'll reduce it by, well, nobody knows that. Nobody will know that till after the event. But we do need to monitor it very carefully to watch that. As I say, Cambodia is the key concern. So there you have it. There you have a discussion on West Africa. We've talked about production, generally better than may have been expected, and a note of caution on the potential impact of El Nino. Thanks very much for listening, and I will hand back to Isaac if there are any questions. Isaac.
Yes, Jim, thank you very much for the presentation. We have a number of questions. We try to answer them. The first is, what are the underlying factors for the production forecasts in January? Which tools are being used?
Okay, I'm not quite sure. When we make a forecast, we will look at, first of all, we don't actually make forecasts on production until the crop has started. And what we look at is arrivals compared to the previous years. We look at the weather conditions, we look at any changes in the hectare, we look at the tree age, but mostly we look at trade. That's how we arrive at our, I won't even call them forecasts, they're kind of estimation. And what we try to do is we try to compare the estimates, official estimates, with the estimates derived from analysis of trade and any other major conditions. That's how we work. I think governments work on the basis of, some of them work on the basis of surveys, but most of those are very limited areas. So they look at the weather, they look at the growers they know. As far as I know, no country does a really rigorous crop forecast. It would be great if that were to happen. That would make a big difference. And now with electronic tools, there is a possibility that that will happen in the future. Isaac.
Okay. So the next question, I want to know, what are the factors driving the structural increase in production in West Africa, especially the spectacular growth in Cote d'Ivoire? Is it because of area increase, yield, or both? Which factor play a dominant role?
Yeah, great. That's a really interesting question. It's been something we've looked at many times. We're not the only ones. You can read a lot on this. And some of the development organizations, as well as regulators, have published some very good work that can answer that question. My answer to that question is primarily in West Africa, it's been an extension of the area. So more trees planted on more land. We have seen some improvements in outturn yields. So in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, today we're probably looking at an outturn yield on average probably around 475 kilos per hectare. If you go back 10 years, that was probably around, I'm just trying to think back. There was a time when it was as low as 250, but it's not been the main driver in recent years. The main driver in recent years is the maturing of more trees that have been planted on more land. Those have generally been local varieties. The typical way of extension has been to use seeds rather than seedlings. In West Africa, typically, there has not been a supply of improved seedlings. So Cambodian growth, for example, was driven by the discovery of a new variety, or the development of a new variety, and rigorous efforts to supply seedlings of that variety, and it worked. Tanzania has been developing for many years improved varieties and is distributing those. It has now got varieties that are resistant to certain pests and diseases, and that is driving production there. But in West Africa, mainly, it's been more trees on more land. Isaac.
Thank you. The next question is on processing. How comparable are processing costs across West African countries compared to Asian competitors?
Yeah, great question. I talk to a lot of processors, so the information I'll give you is based on conversations with them. Generally speaking, the lowest costs of processing in the world are found in Vietnam. African factories range from around about, I think the best I've heard a figure as low as 260 euros. Let's call it $290 per ton of raw cashew nuts. But most factories are above that. A reasonable target for a factory at the moment is around about $400, and that's possible, and many do it. But in development, and many of these factories are new, so they're not yet at their most efficient. Most will be aiming to get below $350 per ton. At which level, if you take the combination of supply chain cost and processing cost, they will be competitive. The key things, of course, are supply chain, buying the right raw material, buying raw material that you can process easily, particularly peel. Number one. Number two, good management. Buying the right machines, putting them in the right place and organizing them. And number three is training people and workers. You may need far fewer workers today, but you'd certainly need workers, a significant number of workers in a factory. Maybe you might need 800 to 1,000 workers in a 15,000 ton factory, particularly in the rework after peeling. That's an area where you could get a lot of breakage, and you can get a lot of losses. So those are areas that need careful management. So if Vietnam is between $150 and $200 a ton, the best in West Africa is probably, in truth, around about $300 a ton, and the average for the good processor is somewhere just over $400 a ton. And there are, of course, examples of much higher, but we're not going to talk about small or inefficient factories in this context. Isaac.
Another question I wanted, still on the processing costs for African processors, wanted to know what the breakdown of this cost is, the 400 USD per metric ton. What goes into labor, power, and then depreciation and any other factors?
That's a whole webinar in itself.
No.
I couldn't break that down today.
Okay. The next question, are processors gaining from the regulations in countries where these are introduced?
I think it's fair to say that processors have benefited from things like the window where exports are banned, typically February, March, sometimes into April, where the processors can buy in the market. They've certainly benefited from that. They have certainly benefited from increases in production. And I think it varies widely from country to country. So you can see in Benin and Cote d'Ivoire, highly interventionist policies, highly interventionist regulatory systems, and that has helped processors. Now, balancing that against assisting farmers is important, and it would be the case that the regulation doesn't always benefit farmers because the drive has often been to get processing on the way. And the reason that the emphasis has been on processing is, I think, because it's always been assumed that development in processing, more value addition in the country, will eventually benefit the farmers, i.e. that processors will develop better linkages with farmers and processors will reward farmers more fairly. Now, that hasn't often been the case, to be honest. There are examples of processors doing just that, but there are more examples of processors not working with farmers, just working with traders and effectively getting around the regulations. Why do I mention this? The question was about have processors benefited. But what I'm saying is processors have benefited, but they haven't always passed those benefits on to farmers in the way they might have. And that then eventually means that some of those supports may be withdrawn or changed. And I do think they need a significant review. Then you can look at things like corporation tax holidays. Yes, they've benefited from those. Duty-free import of the equipment. Yes, they've benefited from those. Promotion of finance for working capital, particularly in the sectors. Yes, they've benefited from that. So generally speaking, regulations have been good for processors by reducing competition in the supply chain and offering certain fiscal benefits. The question on whether it benefited farmers is more complex and not at all clear that it has benefited farmers. Having said that, farmers are producing more. So they're definitely gaining from the production of cashews. So there is a balance there. But all in all, if we look at the development of processing, would say it's been positive in recent years. Why it hasn't happened in some countries in the way it has happened in others is often due to simple local conditions, competition for raw nuts, as in Ghana's situation. And you would imagine and hope that the introduction of additional regulation would give processing in the country something of a boost. That's a really interesting topic, though, and there are some articles written on that. I've written some myself. There was one called the Cashew Policy series written about 3 years ago. It was a Prosper Cashew project. It's available online, and there's an analysis in there of the impact on processing of regulation across West Africa. Now, it only covered the period up to 2023, but most of the conclusions would remain true. That is available online. You could drop me a line if you can't find it. Isaac.
Okay. So on El Nino, should we consider that the El Nino of 2026-2027 will mainly affect the RCN production in India and Indonesia only? Other countries will not be affected?
No, that's not what I said. What I said was that the greatest risk is in Southeast Asia. So the greatest risk will be Cambodia, Vietnam. Indonesia, probably will be affected too. And if we look at India, there is a chance that India is impacted, but it doesn't appear to be. It would be the monsoon of this year that would be impacted, and that doesn't appear to be a major concern at this point in time. And I looked at 1998, a typical, a similar rather El Nino event, and it didn't affect production in India. What I think we can say is key risk area Cambodia, Vietnam, less of a risk India. Indonesia is high risk, but production, of course, is quite low. There's also a risk in Brazil, but we're much later in the cycle, so that would not be this crop. That might be a following crop. But West Africa, well, Africa generally, much less likely to be impacted. So it's not India, Indonesia, it's Cambodia, Vietnam, where the key concern, as I read it, would stand. But don't just take my word on El Nino. El Nino is going to develop, it needs to be followed, and it's readily available online. But make sure you're looking at the right areas. Make sure you're looking at Southeast Asia, Indonesia to a lesser extent, and potentially at India. But I'm not that concerned about India at the moment. Thanks for that question. Interesting one. Isaac.
Right. We have a few questions more. You have talked about organic cashew in Burkina Faso. Do you think that this is a comparative advantage for the country? And how can the industry set itself apart in the region and on export markets in Europe?
Production of organic cashews is a comparative advantage. It's only an advantage, of course, if those nuts are processed in organic certified processing plants. And of course, it's only an advantage if markets are found for those organic cashews. So I would say the key thing in positioning in the organic market is to establish the authenticity of the product and the authenticity of the certification. Number one. There is sometimes, and we've seen this in some major producing countries in the past, a temptation just to treat it as another brand or another commodity, and that tends to lead to corners being cut, and it leads to difficult conditions. If you're going into organic production, you have to go fully into it. Now, before anyone starts to think this is the answer, as I've heard sometimes, this is the answer to all our problems. Let's put it in some perspective. Organic cashews remain a relatively small part of the market. It's less than 10% of the European market. It's growing, and it's growing quickly, but it's less than 10% of the market. Organic cashews are sensitive to price increases. So in 2022, for example, when we saw consumers in Europe become a little bit stressed with high inflation and high energy costs, they stopped buying a lot of organic products, but particularly that we know they stopped buying organic cashews. So one has to be, fully prepared for a long haul to develop the right certification, good branding, the right story, and of course you need to have a supply chain linkage. Now, most cashew processors are not positioned to deal with farmers. Unfortunately, they buy from traders. Those that buy from traders are unlikely to be able to develop a good, robust organic supply chain. So you definitely need to take a full supply chain approach if you're going into the organic business, and you need to be patient. So is it an opportunity? Yes, but it's not the answer to all of the problems of the cashew sector, as some might say, simply because it will only absorb a small proportion of the production. We have seen a kind of a version of a lot of small factories in Vietnam looking for organic certification, but we've also seen in that there's some mismatches, even some corruption of the system, unfortunately, and that's just not good news. It damages the whole brand, so to speak. I would expect organic consumption to continue to increase. We will see more and more interest from supermarkets, especially in Europe, but be cautious. Entering this should not be undertaken lightly. Interesting topic. One day we will do a little bit of an analysis on the organic cashew market for this webinar. To be honest, I've hesitated to do that because I'm a little bit concerned that people might reach the conclusion, this looks good, let's all go organic. And that would not be, it's not neither feasible, it's probably not possible either. And that's one of the reasons I've hesitated to bring it onto the webinar. Isaac. Have we lost Isaac?
Sorry, Jim, I'm back. Some technical challenges here. We have two more questions. Just a moment, I'll pull those out. Yes. So, what are the factors that are likely to have affected the quality of raw cashew nuts in some West African countries like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire? Ultimately, the rains or excess heat?
I think it was the I think there were three factors that I've heard of. Again, I'm not an expert on agronomy, but I can tell you what people are saying. So they're saying that low temperatures, very hot, then followed by very cool, that was a factor. And then rains at the wrong time. Those two factors are the two things I've heard mentioned. There may have been an element of wet harvest too, post-harvest storage under rainy conditions, and that will definitely damage the quality of the nuts. We don't really have, at this moment in time, a conclusive analysis of it. What I'm telling you is things that mainly processors have said to me over the last 2 or 3 months. And those would be the factors. I assume someone will do a proper analysis of that in the coming months, and we will get that and we can learn from that. But what I mentioned is basically what I'm hearing from the processors. Isaac.
Yes, we have a suggestion here for countries like Nigeria, as they plan to ban or introduce export tax, but the best option for them will be to introduce a processing buy-in window for starting some weeks or months in the season. What is your ideal on this?
I like that idea. It has been effective. Basically, it limits competition in the supply chain during the period of the window. That gives processors the opportunity. They still need to have the cash in hand to buy. I suspect if you introduce such a window, it's probably also a good idea to either introduce a reference price, so you inform farmers of what the price should be, or, and I would be hesitant on this, or a minimum price, as we've seen in Cote d'Ivoire. But I think you do need, given that you're artificially intervening to limit competition in the supply chain, even if it is just for a maybe perhaps 6 to 8 week period, I think that it does need either some form of information or some form of protection for farmers just to maintain farm gate prices. I agree with the questioner. I think it would have a positive impact on processors. In fact, I suspect it would have more of a positive impact on processors than something like a high level of export tax or a ban. It'd be far more positive. What we've noticed over the years looking at cashew policy and interventions from governments is that the more positive interventions have had much bigger impact than restrictions and severe regulations. And that's, I think, because it is so difficult to implement severe regulations. It would be very difficult in a huge country like Nigeria, for example, to implement an export ban. The window, much less so. That can work. You would need to consider how do the local traders, because everything comes down to the local, how will the local traders react? How would they manage it? How would they cooperate with it? But they are identifiable and they are licensed. So then you can do that. So yeah, I think the window would be a good idea. I think also the window, is something that you could introduce relatively quickly and without a risk of any major negative impact in the chain. Again, a lot of the processors are also exporters of raw cashew nuts, so there's some consideration for that to be there. Maybe some form of traceability in the supply chain. But generally speaking, yes, I would think that's quite a good idea. Isaac.
Okay. All right. What percentage of domestic production has gone through informal channels in highly regulated countries? Did you say 50% in Benin?
I did. In Benin, it's huge. Last year in India, you could buy a cashew that was described as Benin, Nigeria, or Benin, Togo. And that meant it was Benin raw nuts that had been exported through either Nigeria or Togo. Buyers like Benin raw cashew nuts, they're very good quality, good processing characteristics, color and flavor. So yeah, about half the crop went out through those channels. In other countries, it's less. I mean, in Benin, it's clearly to bypass the ban. I mean, that's obvious. But in other countries, it's for other reasons. It can be logistics, it could be export tax avoidance. But we do see significant quantities. I mean, we could say that perhaps in Guinea-Bissau, it might have got as high as 25% at one time. In Cote d'Ivoire, it may have been around 8% at its peak. So it's significant, and and obviously it has an impact on the market.
All right.
There is again some. Sorry, go ahead.
If you're done with this question, we move on. If not, you can finish.
Yeah, move on, Isaac. Move on.
Okay, great. So the next session will be on the 5th of August. What should we expect between now and then?
Well, between now and then, I don't think we're going to see a great deal of volatility in the market. I think prices will remain quite steady. I think demand will be relatively hesitant. If the conflict in the Gulf gets worse, I think it'll be very negative for consumer sentiment, and buying will slow down as a result. But generally speaking, I'd see a next few weeks relatively calm period. It's that time of year when things tend to be calm. I don't see a great deal of price volatility. I wouldn't be surprised if cashew kernels firmed up a little bit in price. I wouldn't be surprised if raw cashew nuts did nothing, to be honest, in terms of price. There will be a bit more buying, of course, because, again, buyers need to buy. So I think, in short, relatively calm period, but second half of August will be more interesting. It'll start to come to life again then, and we'll start to get some read on Southern Hemisphere crops, and we'll even get some indication of the impact of El Nino on cashew production for 2027. So just a word then, thanks to everyone for attending today. These are really good questions, and I would thank the questioners particularly. Thanks to all ACA staff interpreters for facilitating this webinar. And I look forward to chatting again cashews on the 5th of August. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Isaac.
Thank you, Jim, for today's presentation. It was great, and the analysis was very insightful. Before we go, I'd like to remind all participants that online registration for the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo, which will take place in Accra, Ghana from 15th to 18th September 2026 is ongoing. We are still within the early bird registration period, so you may want to register now and enjoy up to 40% discount on all conference rates. We want to say a very big thank you to our proud partners and sponsors, the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Projects, the Cashew Club, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Thank you to all of you for joining. We see you again on the 5th of August 2026. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.